Good evening. My story takes place in February of 1981. I'm 23 years old, recently out of college. President Reagan has been in the White House for a month. I'm freaked out, not sure what to do, and I figure that a master's degree in geography is probably not a bad thing to pursue. So I decided that I need to take a trip to the University of Wisconsin from Ohio, where I lived. So, on a cold day in February, I got on the Shenandoah Amtrak train headed for Madison, Wisconsin. Switched the trains, I got on the Empire Builder, I think in Chicago, and I found out that there is no train stop in Madison, Wisconsin. But at about 12:30 that night, I did disembark on a town called Columbus, Wisconsin. Columbus, Wisconsin is 28 miles from Madison. So, I'm just going to spend the night somewhere and hitchhike the next morning. The train leaves, I look at the train station, it's locked up. There's nothing to do. Columbus, Wisconsin is a beautiful little historic town. I walk the town hither and yon. I see not a single human being. I see not a single car. I see nothing alive. I go back to the train station where there's a phone booth, and I dial 911. The dispatch lady gets on the phone and says, "What's your emergency?" So I tell her what's up, and after about 5 minutes, she says, "What's your emergency?" And I said, "I'm calling to report my own future death. By morning, I will not be alive. I will die of hyperthermia." She says, "Please stay there. I'll have a cruiser there in 10 minutes. Now, I'm a child of the 70s. I have heard many times, "I'll have a policeman there in 10 minutes. I was never there in 10 minutes, I can tell you that. I always ran away. But this time, I stayed and waited for the policeman. He put me in his cruiser. We went for a little ride. He interviewed me a little bit, and he says, "I have an idea." A few minutes later, we pull into a teeny little regional hospital. He says, "You wait in the car." He goes into the hospital, comes out, and says, "You can stay here for tonight." So I go in, he introduces me to the night nurse, and then he leaves. And I say, "Thank you so much for letting me spend the night in the lobby." And she says, "Mr. Ingram, you won't be in the lobby. We have a private hospital room for you." So they show me to my room, and I am snug in my hospital bed for the night. And I wake up bright and early the next morning. There's a knock on the door. They say, "Breakfast." They bring in a cart, and I have a beautiful Midwestern breakfast. I've got eggs and ham and oatmeal and a pat of butter and a cup of coffee, and I'm happy. I take a shower, get dressed for my interview, and I'm now ready to hitchhike to Madison. There's a knock on the door, and the nurse says, "Mr. Ingram, we have a phone call for you." A few seconds, the phone is going to ring. A few seconds later, the phone rings, and I pick it up and say, "Hello." The person at the other end says, "Mr. Ingram, this is the sheriff. I've got an officer who has to go to Madison this morning, and if you could be ready in 20 minutes, we'll give you a ride." So I say, "I'll be ready. 20 minutes, I'm there." So I quickly get dressed because my mother raised me well, so I have to be very kind and say thank you to all the nurses who were so kind to me. And I do so, and I go outside, and the police officer picks me up, and he says, "Where are you going at the University of Wisconsin?" I say, "To the geography department, which is in Science Hall." He says, "I know exactly where that is." So he drops me off at Science Hall, and I go in, and I'm in my 1950s Dapper sport jacket and my used wool pants, and, probably had a funny hat, and because it's geography after all. So I go in, and I have a full day of interviews, and I'm talking to all these different geography professors, and I think I'm doing pretty well. The last interview of the day is with the department head. And he says, "I hear you've done pretty well on your interviews." And I said, "Well, thank you." He says, "But is there anything you'd like to tell me?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure." He says, "Well, you are the first person who was interviewed for the master's program who was delivered to our door by a county sheriff." So that's my story.